You're watching Mr. Geronimo. Tonight we're entering the unknown. The smell is what I remember first. Not the screaming, not the way the firelight bent in directions fire should not bend, and not the silence that swallowed the forest whole like a throat closing around a stone. It was the smell. A musk so thick and so wrong that my body understood the danger before my mind had even begun to process what was standing at the edge of the clearing. Every hair on my arms lifted, my stomach dropped as though I had stepped off a cliff, and somewhere behind my ribs, in the oldest and most honest part of my brain, a voice whispered a single word: run. But I am getting ahead of myself. If I am going to tell you what happened in Bethel, I need to start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the first lie was told, and that lie is the reason not everyone came home. I had been stationed at the Bethel district for 3 summers by the time this happened. The post was a small cabin wedged between a gravel service road and an ocean of Douglas fir and western red cedar that stretched north for more miles than most people could walk in a week. My duties were routine: trail maintenance, fire watch, permit checks. Occasionally I would help a lost hiker find the trailhead or radio in a report about a downed tree blocking one of the old logging roads. It was quiet work, the kind of work that teaches you to listen, and after 3 years of listening, I had come to believe I understood the rhythms of that forest, the way a musician understands the tempo of a familiar song. I was wrong. I did not understand anything at all. The group arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of July. I was replacing a section of split-rail fencing near the trailhead parking area when a convoy of 3 vehicles pulled in, kicking up a plume of dust that hung in the still air like smoke. They climbed out laughing. 8 of them loaded down with coolers and hiking packs and rifle cases. Summer people. The kind of people who plan their wilderness trips the way they plan their vacations to beach resorts. They had reservations at a backcountry campsite 6 miles up the North Fork Trail, a place called Ridgeback Flat, and they had come prepared for a full week of hunting, fishing, and what one of them described as getting away from the noise of the real world. I remember that phrase because I would think about it many times in the days that followed. The real world, as though what existed out here in the timber was somehow less real, as though the things that lived and moved and breathed in the space between the trees were imaginary. James Smith was the first to approach me. He was 34, lean, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from being the person who organizes things. He had a clipboard. He actually had a clipboard with a printed itinerary, and he handed me a copy of their group permit with a smile that told me he expected everything to go smoothly. Standing behind him was Emily Johnson, 38, who I later learned was his partner. She had a pair of expensive binoculars around her neck and a field guide to Pacific Northwest birds tucked under her arm. She was the one who asked me about the trails, the water sources, the best spots to see elk. She was curious in that genuine way that made me want to help, and I found myself drawing a rough map on the back of a maintenance log, marking the places where the game trails crossed the hiking paths and where the creek ran deepest. Michael Williams was 45 and built like a man who had spent decades doing physical work. He had a beard that was more gray than brown and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as the fence posts I was repairing. He was quiet but not unfriendly, and he carried himself with the unhurried patience of someone who had spent real time in the wilderness before. His wife, Jessica Garcia, was 41 and carried a camera bag that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She was a photographer. She told me she wanted to capture the way the light moved through the old-growth canopy, the way it shattered into ribbons and columns that looked almost solid. I told her the best light was in the early morning, about an hour after sunrise, when the mist was still rising off the creek. She thanked me and wrote it down in a small notebook. Robert Wilson was 47 and the loudest of the group. He had a laugh that echoed off the ridgeline, and he immediately began telling me about the 12-point buck he had taken in Montana the previous fall. He was a hunter, not just a weekend hobbyist, but a serious, dedicated hunter who tracked animals the way some people track stocks or weather patterns. He was the one who had pushed for Bethel specifically, he told me, because he had heard the elk population in the North Fork drainage was thriving and unhunted. His friend Amanda Clark, 36, was quieter but no less capable. She wore a faded canvas jacket with the kind of patched and restitched wear that comes from actual use, and she had a compound bow in a hard case that she handled with the familiarity of someone who had drawn a bowstring 10,000 times. The last 2 members of the group were William Rodriguez, 63, and Ashley Martinez, 47. William was the eldest by more than a decade, and there was something about him that commanded a quiet respect from the others. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though every step was considered, and he had a way of looking at the forest that was different from the rest of the group. They looked at the trees and saw scenery. William looked at the trees and seemed to be reading something written there, something the rest of them could not see. Ashley was his niece, and she stayed close to him, matching his pace, occasionally resting her hand on his arm when the ground was uneven. She had a warmth about her that reminded me of the women in the small towns further south, the ones who brought casseroles to strangers and remembered everyone's birthday. She smiled at me as they gathered their gear, and I smiled back, and that is a moment I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count because of what it became. It became the last normal moment, the last moment before the forest opened its mouth. I gave them the standard briefing. Stay on the marked trails, store your food in bear canisters, or hang it from a line at least 10 feet off the ground and 4 feet from the nearest trunk. Do not approach wildlife. If you hear something at night, stay in your tent. That last part was not official protocol. It was something I had started telling people after my second summer, after I had spent enough nights alone in that cabin listening to the sounds the forest made when it thought no one was paying attention. Sounds that did not match any animal I knew. Sounds that did not match anything at all. They headed up the trail around noon, and I watched them go, 8 figures shrinking into the green corridor of the North Fork path until the trees swallowed them whole. I went back to my fencing. I ate lunch at my desk. I filed 2 reports and cleaned the gutters on the equipment shed. And then, around 4 in the afternoon, something happened that I did not think much of at the time but that I have thought about every single day since. I was standing on the porch of my cabin, looking north toward the ridge where the trail climbed into the high country, and I heard a sound. It was distant, muffled by miles of timber, but it was unmistakable. It was an elk bugle. Now, an elk bugle in July is not unheard of, but it is unusual. The rut does not begin until September, sometimes late August in the high elevations, and outside of that period, bull elk are generally silent. But this was not what made me pause. What made me pause was the quality of the sound. It was almost right, almost perfect. But there was something in the pitch, something in the way it broke at the end, that sounded less like an animal calling and more like something learning how to make that sound. Something practicing. I stood on my porch and listened for a long time, but the sound did not come again, and eventually I told myself it was nothing and went inside. The first 2 days passed without incident. I saw no smoke on the ridge. I heard no distress calls on the radio. The weather held, warm and dry, with a ceiling of high white clouds that kept the worst of the sun off the trails. On the 3rd morning, Wednesday, I hiked up to the North Fork Junction to check a water gauge and clear a blowdown that had been reported the previous week. The trail was quiet. The only sound the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the packed earth and the occasional chatter of a Steller's jay in the branches overhead. I reached the junction around 10 and was kneeling beside the gauge, recording the water level in my field notebook, when I noticed something on the ground. It was a track, a single footprint pressed into the soft mud at the edge of the creek, about 20 feet upstream from the gauge. It was human in shape, 5 toes, a heel, an arch, but it was wrong in ways that took me a moment to identify. First, it was large. Not unusually large for a man, but larger than any of the boot prints I had seen on the trail, and this print was bare, no shoe, no sandal. A naked foot pressed into the mud with enough force to sink nearly 2 inches into the substrate. Second, the toes were too long. I crouched beside the print and stared at it, trying to convince myself that I was seeing a distortion caused by the angle of the slope or the texture of the mud. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. The toes were elongated, almost finger-like, and they were spread in a way that human toes do not naturally spread, as though whatever had made this print used its feet the way a hand grips a branch. I took a photograph. I measured the print with my pocket knife, blade tip to blade tip, 14 inches. Then I stood and looked upstream, scanning the bank for more tracks. I found 2 more, spaced about 4 feet apart, heading north along the creek before disappearing where the bank turned to rock. 4 feet between steps. That was a stride length that suggested something tall, something moving with purpose. I marked the location on my map and continued to the blowdown, but my mind kept returning to those prints, turning them over the way you turn a word you do not recognize, trying to find the meaning in the shape. That evening, I tried to reach the group on the radio. I wanted to check in, maybe ask if any of them had been walking barefoot near the creek, though I already knew the answer. The radio returned only static. This was not entirely unusual. The terrain in the North Fork drainage was broken and steep, full of ravines and rock faces that scattered radio signals like light through a prism. But the static had a quality to it that I did not like. It was not the clean hiss of a dead channel. It was layered, textured, as though something was moving inside the frequency, breathing against the microphone from the other side. I slept poorly that night. I kept waking to sounds that were not quite sounds, silences that were not quite silent, and once, around 3 in the morning, I sat bolt upright in my cot because I was certain, absolutely certain, that something was standing on the porch outside my cabin, not walking, not moving, just standing there, breathing. I lay in the lightless room with my hand on the flashlight beside my pillow and listened until my heartbeat was the only sound left, and then I lay there longer, because the absence of sound was worse than the sound itself. When something in the forest goes quiet, it means something else is listening. On Thursday morning, I found the second set of prints. They were on my porch. The same elongated toes, the same impossible depth. But these prints were different in one critical way. They were facing my front door. Whatever had stood on my porch in the small hours of the morning had not been passing through. It had come to my cabin specifically. It had walked up the 3 wooden steps, crossed the 8 feet of planking to my door, and stood there. The print suggested it had stood there for a long time. The impressions were deep, settled, the kind of marks left by weight held in one position for minutes, maybe longer. And then it had turned, the balls of the feet pivoting on the boards, and walked back down the steps and into the tree line. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing where the gravel met the undergrowth, and there they stopped, not faded, not obscured by leaves or grass, stopped, as though whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist at that precise point, or as though it had changed into something that did not leave tracks at all. I radioed the district office and reported the prints. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda who had been working the Bethel frequency for longer than I had been alive, listened without interrupting and then said something that I have never forgotten. She said, "Be careful with what you go looking for out there. The old-timers used to say that in Bethel, the forest does not have secrets, it has teeth." I asked her what she meant. She told me she did not know. She said she was just repeating what she had been told when she first started, and that in 30 years she had never had a reason to question it. I thanked her and signed off, and then I packed a day bag and headed up the North Fork Trail toward Ridgeback Flat, because whatever was making those prints was between me and 8 people who did not know it was there. If you have been watching this and have not yet tapped the like button or left a comment, I would ask you to consider doing so now. These accounts do not reach people on their own, and what I am about to describe is something I believe others need to hear. Your support makes that possible. I reached the campsite at Ridgeback Flat shortly before noon on Thursday, and what I found there was not what I expected. The camp was intact, the tents were standing, the fire ring held the gray remains of the previous night's fire, the food was properly stored. Everything looked exactly as a well-maintained backcountry campsite should look, with one exception: no one was there. 8 people, 8 packs, 8 sleeping bags, food for a week, water filtration systems, weapons, cameras, clothing, all of it was there. But the people were gone. I called out. My voice fell into the trees and did not come back. I checked each tent. Sleeping bags were unzipped and spread flat, as though the occupants had risen normally and simply walked away. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no overturned cookware. The camp was not abandoned in panic. It was abandoned the way a house is abandoned when the residents simply decide, all at once, to leave and never return. I found James Smith's clipboard on a folding table near the fire ring. The itinerary was still clipped to it. Thursday's entry read, in his neat handwriting, morning hike to the overlook, afternoon fishing at the beaver ponds, evening campfire. Below that, in handwriting that was not his, in letters that were shaky and pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through, were 4 words. "It knows our voices." I read those words 3 times. Then I put the clipboard down and unholstered the canister of bear spray on my belt, and I began to walk the perimeter of the campsite, scanning the ground for tracks, for broken branches, for any sign of which direction 8 adult human beings had gone. I found the tracks quickly. They were easy to follow because they were uniform, orderly, spaced at regular intervals. 8 sets of boot prints heading due north from the campsite, away from the trail, into the deepest and most remote section of the Bethel wilderness. They walked in a single file line, which was strange. They walked at a consistent pace, which was stranger. And they walked directly into a section of forest that had no trail, no path, no clearing, and no reason for anyone to enter unless they were following something, or unless something was leading them. I followed the tracks for approximately 2 miles into the timber before the canopy closed overhead so completely that the air beneath it turned to a cold gray murk that felt less like shade and more like submersion. The trees here were old. Not just old, but ancient. Their trunks wider than my outstretched arms, their bark scarred with the claw marks of bears and the boreholes of insects that had been feeding on them for centuries. The undergrowth was sparse. In forest this dense, so little light reaches the floor that almost nothing grows there, and the ground was a carpet of brown needles and decomposing wood that muffled every footstep into silence. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the blood in my ears. I could hear nothing else. The birds were gone. The insects were gone. The wind, which had been threading through the canopy all morning, had stopped as though the air itself had decided to hold its breath. The tracks continued north in that same single-file formation. I counted the prints periodically to make sure I was still following 8 sets, and for the first mile and a half, I was. 8 people walking in a straight line into nowhere. But at the 2-mile mark, something changed. The tracks converged. The spacing between the individual sets narrowed until they overlapped, and then, at a point between 2 massive cedar trunks that leaned toward each other like the pillars of a gate, the 8 sets of tracks became one. Not one set of tracks as in one person's prints, but one as in all 8 sets occupied the same space, the same prints, the same steps, as though 8 people had somehow merged into a single pair of feet. I knelt beside the convergence point and studied it for a long time. The impressions were deep, far deeper than any single person could produce, as though the full weight of 8 bodies was pressing down through 2 feet. And those feet were no longer wearing boots. They were bare, and the toes were long. I will tell you now what I did not want to admit to myself in that moment. I knew what I was looking at, not because I had ever seen it before, but because I had heard about it. In my years working remote posts, I had sat around enough campfires and listened to enough stories from people who had spent their entire lives in wild places. Indigenous rangers, retired trail workers, old hunters who spoke about certain things only after the fire had burned down to coals and the shadows had drawn close enough to listen. They spoke about creatures that existed on the boundary between the human and the inhuman, things that could wear a person the way a person wears a coat, things that could learn a voice the way a musician learns a melody, perfectly, flawlessly, until you could not tell the copy from the original. They called them by a name that many of those same storytellers said should never be spoken aloud, because to speak the name was to invite the attention of the thing itself, skinwalkers. I had always listened to those stories with the respectful skepticism of someone who valued the culture behind them but did not believe in their literal truth. I was a practical man. I believed in what I could measure, what I could document, what I could file in a report and send to the district office with a clear conscience. But kneeling there in the murk of that ancient forest, staring at the impossible convergence of 8 sets of human tracks into one set of something that was not human at all, I felt my skepticism crack like thin ice under a heavy boot, and beneath it was something cold and fathomless and very, very old. I stood up. I drew a slow breath through my nose and immediately regretted it. There it was, the smell. The same musk I would later recognize at the clearing. A scent like wet animal hide left in the sun until it rotted, underlaid with something chemical and sharp, like ozone before a lightning strike. It was everywhere. It saturated the air beneath the canopy, as though the forest itself was sweating it out through its bark and its needles and its soil. My eyes watered, my throat constricted, and somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the trees, something moved. I did not see it. I heard it, or rather, I heard the absence it created. A pocket of silence that shifted through the undergrowth about 50 yards ahead and slightly to my left, displacing the already minimal sound the way a stone displaces water. It was large. I could tell by the radius of the silence. Whatever was moving out there occupied a significant space, and it was moving parallel to me, matching my position, keeping pace without approaching. I stood perfectly still and listened. The silence moved. It circled. It stopped. And then, from the exact center of that silence, a voice spoke. It said, "Hey, are you coming?" It was Emily Johnson's voice. I recognized it instantly. The same intonation, the same rhythm, the same slight upward lilt at the end of a question that I had heard when she asked me about the elk trails 2 days before. But Emily Johnson was not standing 50 yards away in the undergrowth. Emily Johnson's tracks led into a convergence point that ended in bare, elongated footprints that were not hers. Whatever was speaking with her voice was not her, and it knew I was there. I did not answer. I took a single step backward, slowly, planting my foot with deliberate care to avoid snapping a twig or rustling the needles. The voice came again, closer this time, maybe 30 yards. "We found something amazing. You have to come see." Same voice, same Emily. But there was something beneath the words now, a harmonic that did not belong, a resonance that was too deep, too layered, as though the voice was being produced not by a single throat, but by several, stacked one inside the other like nesting dolls of sound. My hand shook on the bear spray. I took another step back. Then a different voice spoke, Robert Wilson, the same booming, confident tone I had heard in the parking lot. "Come on, stop messing around, we are right over here." It came from a different direction, not where the first voice had been, but to my right, about 40 yards into a stand of hemlock so thick that visibility dropped to zero past the first few trunks. Two voices, two directions, neither of them belonging to the people they claimed to be. I turned and I walked, not ran. Walking was a decision. Walking was controlled. Walking said, "I am not prey." I followed my own tracks back toward the campsite, and the voices followed me. They multiplied. James called my title from somewhere in the canopy above, his voice drifting down through the branches like falling leaves. Jessica called from behind me, close, too close, her voice carrying the same photographic enthusiasm she had shown at the trailhead. "The light here is incredible. You really need to see this." Michael's voice, that low, steady baritone, came from directly ahead of me on the path, which meant that whatever was producing it had circled around and was now between me and the campsite. I stopped. The voices stopped. The silence that replaced them was so total and so absolute that I could hear the saliva click in my throat when I swallowed. I stood in that silence for what felt like an hour but was probably less than a minute, and then I did something that I am not proud of, but that I believe saved my life. I stepped off the track. I left the path the 8 of them had taken and moved laterally, due east, pushing through the undergrowth at an angle that would bring me back to the main trail about a mile south of the campsite. I moved as quietly as I could, which was not very quiet. The bracken crackled. The branches grabbed at my pack and my sleeves, but the voices did not follow. Whatever was producing them seemed tethered to the path, to the route the 8 hikers had taken, as though it could only operate along the line it had drawn them down. I reached the main trail 40 minutes later. My shirt was soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. My hands were still shaking. I checked behind me every few steps, scanning the tree line for movement, for shape, for the displacement of shadow that would tell me something was there. I saw nothing. But the smell followed me. It clung to my jacket, my hair, the inside of my nostrils. It was still there when I reached my cabin. It was still there when I locked the door. I spent the next 3 hours on the radio. I called the district office. I called the county sheriff. I called search and rescue in the neighboring jurisdiction. I told them there were 8 missing persons at Ridgeback Flat. I told them the camp was intact but abandoned. I told them I had followed tracks into the backcountry and found evidence of something I could not explain. I did not tell them about the voices. I did not tell them about the convergence of the tracks. I did not tell them about the smell. I reported what I thought they would believe and kept the rest locked behind my teeth because I knew what would happen if I said it out loud. They would send someone to evaluate me instead of someone to find the missing hikers. The search team arrived Friday morning, 12 people, 2 tracking canines, a helicopter on standby at the county airfield. They set up a command post at the trailhead and began a systematic grid search of the area surrounding Ridgeback Flat. I led the first team to the campsite and showed them what I had found. They photographed the tents, the gear, the clipboard with its 4 impossible words. They followed the tracks north, the same tracks I had followed the day before, and they found exactly what I had found, the convergence point. The bare prints with the elongated toes, the single set of impossibly deep impressions leading deeper into the timber. But they did not find the voices. Whatever had spoken to me from the undergrowth was silent now, and the forest had returned to something approximating its normal state. Birds called in the canopy. A squirrel chattered from a snag. The wind moved through the trees with the sound of distant water. It was as though the thing had retreated, pulled back, withdrawn to whatever space it occupied when it was not wearing voices that did not belong to it. The lead tracker, a man with 30 years of wilderness experience, stood at the convergence point and stared at the ground for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his face had the expression of someone who has found a word in a language he does not speak and knows, instinctively, that the word means something terrible. They searched for 4 days. They covered every drainage, every ridge, every game trail and logging road within a 10-mile radius of the campsite. The dogs tracked the scent from the camp to the convergence point and then refused to go further, both of them. 2 different dogs from 2 different handlers, and both of them sat down at the same spot and would not move. One of them whined, the other did something I have never seen a trained search dog do. It urinated where it sat, a sign of fear so primal and so absolute that the handler looked at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. An expression that said, "What is out there?" They found Ashley Martinez on the 2nd day. She was sitting at the base of a cedar tree about 3 miles north of the convergence point, her back against the trunk, her legs extended in front of her, her hands folded in her lap. She was alive. Her eyes were open. She was breathing. But she was not present. She stared at the canopy above her with the fixed, unblinking gaze of someone watching something that no one else could see, and when the medics tried to speak to her, she did not respond. She did not flinch when they touched her. She did not react when they lifted her onto the stretcher. She was somewhere else. Wherever her body was, Ashley Martinez was not inside it. They found William Rodriguez the next day, a mile further north, in the same condition, sitting upright, eyes open, breathing, gone. He was positioned at the base of another cedar, and the arrangement was so similar to Ashley's that the search team began calling them sitters, a term that chilled me more than any of the other things I had seen or heard, because it implied a pattern. It implied that whatever had taken them had placed them, arranged them, set them down at the bases of trees like offerings at an altar, alive but emptied, their bodies functioning but their minds pulled out like threads from a garment until nothing remained but the shape. They found Jessica Garcia and Amanda Clark on day 3, a half-mile apart. Same posture, same cedar trees, same hollow stare into the canopy. Jessica's camera was around her neck. The memory card was full. When the investigators reviewed the images later, they found 347 photographs, all taken within a span of approximately 2 hours based on the metadata. The first 50 were normal: trees, light, the creek, a shot of Robert grinning beside a trout he had caught. Then the images changed. Starting at photograph 51, every single frame contained the same subject. It was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadow and branch, its proportions wrong in ways that the brain registered before the eyes could catalog. Too tall, too narrow. Limbs that bent at angles that did not correspond to any skeletal structure I had ever seen in a textbook or a field guide. And its face, in the photographs where the face was visible, was not a face at all. It was a suggestion of a face, a draft, a sketch by something that had seen faces but had not quite understood the spacing, the symmetry, the relationship between the features that makes a face readable as human. In every photograph, the figure was closer than in the one before. By photograph 347, it filled the frame entirely, and Jessica Garcia's camera had stopped taking pictures. The battery was dead, but the metadata said the camera had been fully charged that morning. 300 photographs should not have drained it. Something else had. James Smith and Emily Johnson were found on day 4, together, seated against the same tree, their hands intertwined. Their eyes were open, their mouths were open. And from their open mouths came a sound that the search team reported as a low, continuous hum, a vibration that was felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. It was not a sound either of them should have been capable of producing. It was too low, too sustained, too uniform. It was the sound a machine might make if a machine were trying to replicate a human voice and had gotten stuck on the first note. The medics noted that their heart rates were identical, their breathing was synchronized. Their pupils were dilated to the same degree, so wide that almost no iris was visible. They were not 2 people anymore. They were one system operating through 2 bodies, and whatever was running that system was not James or Emily. Michael Williams and Robert Wilson were never found. The search was called off after 8 days. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, cause unknown. The 6 survivors, if you can call them survivors, were transported to a facility downstate where people with letters after their names spent months trying to understand what had happened to them. I do not know what those specialists concluded. I do not know if Ashley ever spoke again. I do not know if William's eyes ever focused on something in this world rather than whatever he was seeing in the world behind his stare. I was not invited to the follow-up meetings. I was not consulted for the final report. I was told through channels that my account of the voices in the forest was not consistent with known wildlife behavior or environmental phenomena, and that it would be best for everyone if I revised my statement to reflect a more plausible explanation. I did not revise my statement. I resigned my post instead. I left Bethel at the end of that summer, and I have not been back. But I have not stopped thinking about it, not for a single day. I think about the tracks. I think about the convergence point where 8 sets of human footprints became 1 set of something else. I think about the voices that knew names and inflections and the exact way Emily Johnson asked a question. I think about Jessica Garcia's camera and the figure that moved closer with every frame, patient and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world and knew that time was on its side. I think about the 4 words on James Smith's clipboard, written in a hand that was shaking so badly the letters could barely hold their shape. It knows our voices. And I think about something William Rodriguez said to me at the trailhead, on that first day, when the sun was still high and the world still made sense. I had just finished my briefing, the standard warnings about bears and food storage and staying on marked trails, and William had looked at me with those steady, considered eyes and said, "You know what the old folks in my family used to say? They used to say that nothing in the wilderness is ever truly alone. There is always something walking beside you. You just cannot see it until it wants you to." I had smiled at that. I had taken it as the kind of folk wisdom old-timers share to give the forest a personality, to make it feel alive and storied rather than indifferent. I smiled because I thought he was being poetic. I do not smile at those words anymore, because William Rodriguez was not being poetic. He was being precise. There was something walking beside them from the moment they left the trailhead. There was something in the trees, in the silence between the bird calls, in the frequency beneath the static on my radio. It walked beside them for 2 days, learning their voices, memorizing their rhythms, studying the way each of them moved and spoke and breathed until it could reproduce them perfectly. And on the 3rd night, it stopped walking beside them and started walking among them, and not one of them could tell the difference because it had become too good at being them. That is what a skinwalker does. It does not attack. It does not chase. It replaces. It slides into the space between who you are and who others perceive you to be, and it fills that space so completely that by the time anyone realizes something is wrong, the person they knew is already gone, and the thing wearing their voice is already speaking. I am telling you this because of something that has been happening to me in the months since I left Bethel. Something I have not told anyone because I do not know how to say it without sounding like a man who has lost his grip on reality. But I will say it now because I think it matters, and because I think it might be the most important part of this entire account. I hear the voices, not in the forest, not in the wilderness, here, in my apartment, in my car, in the grocery store at 2 in the afternoon with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a teenager scanning my cereal at the checkout. I hear Emily asking if I am coming. I hear Robert telling me to stop messing around. I hear them in the walls and in the pipes and in the silence between songs on the radio. They are faint, they are distant, but they are getting closer. Every week, a little closer. Every night, a little clearer. And last Tuesday, at 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of breathing on my front porch. I did not look. I lay in my bed with the covers pulled to my chin and my hand on the flashlight, and I listened to the slow, deliberate rhythm of something breathing on the other side of my door. And in between the breaths, so soft I almost missed it, I heard a voice. It was my voice, my exact voice. My exact cadence, my exact pitch, my exact way of pausing between sentences. And it was saying the words I had said to the group at the trailhead 3 months ago, on a Tuesday in July when the world was still a place I understood. If you hear something at night, stay in your tent. William Rodriguez was right. Nothing in the wilderness is ever truly alone. But what he did not say, what I do not think he knew, is that the wilderness does not stay in the wilderness. Whatever walked beside them on those trails, whatever learned their voices in the cathedral silence beneath those ancient trees, it followed me home. It learned my voice too. And now it is here. patient and precise, and waiting for the moment when the difference between my voice and its voice becomes so small that no one, not even me, can tell which one is real. I do not sleep anymore. I leave every light in my apartment burning from sunset until sunrise, and every night I sit in the center of my living room with my back against the wall and I listen, because the breathing is still there, and the voice is still practicing, and it is getting better. There is a place in West Virginia where the hills fold into themselves like the ribs of something ancient and half-buried. And if you have never stood at the edge of those ridges at sundown when the light drains from the sky and the hollows fill with a silence so absolute that your own breathing sounds like a foreign language, then you cannot understand what I am about to tell you. I was 51 years old when it happened, and I had spent the better part of 3 decades working for the State Forestry Division, managing trails, cataloging wildlife, pulling lost hikers out of ravines, and I believed with a certainty that bordered on arrogance that there was nothing left in these woods that could surprise me. I was wrong. I was so profoundly and catastrophically wrong that even now, sitting in a room with the lights on and the doors locked and the television murmuring in the background, I cannot close my eyes without seeing it. I cannot fall asleep without hearing the sound it made when it opened those wings. I am not a man who believes in monsters. I was trained in biology, ecology, and wilderness management. I was trained to observe, to document, to remain calm under pressure. But rationality is a luxury that requires a stable world, and what I witnessed in Point Pleasant during the first week of August shattered every notion of stability I had ever constructed. It started with a phone call from Dean Hughes. Dean was 54, a retired game warden who had spent 20 years patrolling the forests and waterways of Mason County, and he was one of the most unshakable men I had ever known. But on the night of August 2nd, when he called me at 11:47, his voice was shaking. He told me he was organizing a week-long trip to the hill country north of Point Pleasant, a group of 6, including himself, hiking, fishing, some backcountry camping along the ridge trails that overlook the Ohio River Valley. He had permits, gear, a full itinerary, and a group of experienced people. But that was not why he was calling. He was calling because something had happened the previous evening while he was scouting a campsite near the old ammunition storage area, the one the military had used during the Second World War, the one the locals called the TNT area. He said he had been walking the perimeter of a clearing when he heard a sound unlike anything he had encountered in 20 years of working in those woods. He described it as a low, resonant hum, almost mechanical, but with an organic quality that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, and it lasted for approximately 90 seconds before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, he saw something standing at the tree line on the far side of the clearing. He could not make out details because the light was nearly gone, but he said it was tall, much taller than any person, and that it had 2 massive appendages folded against its back. It stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, motionless, and then it was simply gone. Not gone as in it walked away. Gone as in it had never been there. I asked him if he had been drinking. He told me he had not touched alcohol in 11 years. I told him I would come. The group assembled on the morning of August 4th at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Dean was already there, standing beside his truck with a map spread across the hood. April Sanders arrived next, driving a mud-spattered Jeep with a kayak strapped to the roof. April was 33, a wildlife photographer who had spent a decade documenting predator-prey dynamics in the Appalachian ecosystem. She was lean, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a cutting humor that could make you laugh and wince simultaneously. A battered pickup pulled into the lot, and Warren Ross climbed out with the slow, deliberate care of a man whose joints had been filing complaints for decades. Warren was 78 years old and had been born and raised in Point Pleasant. He had worked the river barges as a young man, fought in Korea, come home, and spent the next 50 years farming a patch of bottomland along the Ohio that had been in his family since before the Civil War. He knew every hollow, every ridge, every creek bed within 30 miles, and more importantly, he knew the stories. He knew the old stories that the families who had lived in these hills for generations told each other in low voices around kitchen tables after the children had gone to bed. When Dean described what he had seen, Warren said one word: Mothman. He said it quietly, almost reverently. He said people had been seeing it in Point Pleasant since 1966, and that what Dean described matched every account he had ever heard. Then he said something I have thought about every single day since. He said the Mothman does not come without a reason, and when it shows itself, something terrible is about to happen. Erica Henderson and Derek Coleman arrived together. Erica was 47, a high school science teacher from Charleston who spent summers leading youth wilderness programs. She was practical, organized, and carried a first aid kit the size of a suitcase and a satellite phone purchased specifically for this trip. Derek was 58, a retired mining engineer who had spent his career crawling through tunnels beneath the West Virginia mountains. He was broad-shouldered, quiet, and had the patient demeanor of a man who had learned that the earth does not care about your plans. The last to arrive was Norma Jenkins. Norma was 65, a retired librarian from Point Pleasant who had spent 4 decades curating the local history collection. She had studied the Mothman sightings extensively, collecting newspaper clippings, interview transcripts, police reports, and personal correspondence dating back to the original wave of sightings. She had never seen the creature herself, but she believed with absolute conviction that it was real. We loaded our gear and drove north, following a county road that wound through increasingly dense forest until it dead-ended at a trailhead. The trail led up through hardwood forest, climbing steadily along a ridge that offered intermittent views of the valley. We reached the first campsite by early afternoon, a flat grassy area on a bench of land halfway up the ridge, sheltered on 3 sides by dense hemlock and rhododendron. We set up tents in a loose semicircle around a fire ring and spent the remaining daylight gathering firewood and exploring the area. Nothing unusual happened that first afternoon. The woods sounded exactly the way they were supposed to sound, a layered symphony of birdsong, insect noise, and wind moving through the canopy. The light was golden and warm, filtering through the leaves in long angled shafts that made the forest floor glow like stained glass. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was the last time any of us would feel at peace for a very long time. The trouble started after sundown. We were sitting around the fire when Warren began to talk about the TNT area. He told us that in 1966, 2 young couples driving past the abandoned facility saw something standing near one of the igloos. They described a creature roughly 7 feet tall, gray in color, with enormous wings folded against its back, and 2 large, luminous red eyes that reflected headlights with an intensity none of them could describe. They fled at over 100 miles per hour, and the creature followed, flying above the car with its wings fully extended, keeping pace effortlessly. Over the next 13 months, dozens of people reported seeing the same creature. All described the same features: immense height, massive wings, and those eyes, those terrible glowing red eyes that seemed to look not at you, but into you. Warren paused and took a long drink from his canteen. The fire crackled and popped, sending a column of sparks spiraling up into the lightless sky. And then, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed. The suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, dropped 46 vehicles into the frigid water. 46 people died. After the collapse, the Mothman sightings stopped. Warren said that people had come to believe the Mothman was a harbinger, a warning, that it appeared before disasters, not to cause them but to signal their approach. He said every time someone he trusted reported seeing the creature, something bad followed. Nobody spoke for a long time. If you have been enjoying this account so far and you have not yet left a like or a comment, I would ask you to take a moment and do that right now, because it means more than you might realize and it helps others find stories like this one. I was staring into the coals when April grabbed my arm. Her grip was so tight that I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. I looked at her face and saw terror, pure, undiluted animal terror. She was looking past me, into the tree line. I turned around, and I saw it. It was standing approximately 40 yards away, at the edge of the hemlock grove. It was tall, at least 2 feet taller than me, possibly more. Its body was gray, a matte, powdery gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Shaped roughly like a man, but with proportions that were subtly wrong. The shoulders were too wide. The arms were too long. Behind it, folded against its back, were 2 enormous membranous structures that I can only describe as wings, but it was the eyes. 2 large, luminous orbs, glowing with a deep, pulsing red light that had no earthly analog. Not the red of blood, not the red of fire. Something older. Those eyes were looking directly at us. I could feel them the way you feel heat from an open furnace, a pressure against my face that was not physical but was absolutely real. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, a wet, frantic pounding that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, because the woods had gone completely silent. No insects, no frogs, no wind, nothing. Just that pulsing red light and the sound of 6 people trying very hard not to scream. It stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds, and then it opened its wings. The sound those wings made when they unfurled is something I will carry with me until the day I die. It was a deep, resonant thrum that I felt in my chest cavity before I heard it with my ears, a vibration that traveled through the ground and up through my legs and into my rib cage, as though the creature was displacing the air itself. The wingspan was somewhere between 12 and 15 feet, though in the moment it looked larger, impossibly larger, as though the wings extended beyond the tree line and into the sky itself. The membranes were thin and veined, catching the faint glow of the dying fire and translating it into something that looked almost like stained glass, if stained glass were made of skin and shadow, and something that pulsed with its own faint luminescence. Nobody moved. Dean had positioned himself between the creature and the group, his hand on his hunting knife. April had dropped her camera. Erica was gripping the satellite phone with both hands. Derek was standing perfectly still, and I realized he was not frozen in fear. He was studying it, cataloging details with the methodical attention of a man who had spent 30 years analyzing rock formations. Norma was the only one who spoke. She whispered 2 words. "It knows." I do not know what she meant. The creature held its wings open for perhaps 5 seconds. The red glow from its eyes intensified until the surrounding trees were bathed in crimson light that made the hemlock needles look like they were bleeding. Then, with a single downward stroke that scattered the embers of our fire across the campsite, it launched itself into the air. The speed was staggering. One moment it was at the tree line, and the next it was above the canopy, a silhouette blotting out constellations as it passed. I watched it climb, spiraling upward in tight controlled circles, then bank to the west and vanish over the ridge with a speed that no bird, no aircraft, no living thing I had ever seen could match. We stood in silence for a long time after it disappeared. The fire was scattered and dying, orange coals hissing in the damp grass. Slowly, one by one, the sounds of the forest began to return. A cricket, a tree frog, the distant mournful call of a whippoorwill somewhere down in the valley. It was as though the woods themselves had been holding their breath and were only now daring to exhale. Dean said we needed to rebuild the fire. We obeyed without question and sat closer together than before. Nobody suggested going to bed. Warren said that what we had seen matched every historical description: the height, the wings, the gray coloration, and especially the eyes. Every account mentioned the same sensation, not just seeing, being seen, being known. Norma pulled out her notebook and began documenting everything. She told us she had identified 112 reported sightings of the Mothman in the Point Pleasant area since 1966. She said our encounter was consistent with what she classified as a passive observation encounter, where the creature appeared, observed, and departed without aggression. She said there was another category she called pursuit encounters, where the creature actively followed witnesses, sometimes for miles. She said the passive encounters tended to come first. April checked her camera. Every photograph she had taken during the sighting showed the same thing: red. Just red. No shape, no form, no creature. A uniform, featureless plane of deep, saturated red that filled the frame. 9 photographs of nothing but red. She deleted them all and put the camera away. We maintained the fire through the night. At dawn, we held a meeting. Dean wanted to stay, arguing the creature had not been aggressive. April agreed because she wanted photographs. Warren quietly but firmly said staying was a mistake. He told us about a man named Thomas McCoy who saw the Mothman 3 times in November of 1967, ignored the sightings, and was on the Silver Bridge when it collapsed. His legs were crushed, and he spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that he should have paid attention to the eyes. Erica was undecided. She mentioned feeling a pressure behind her eyes during the sighting, not pain exactly, but deeply uncomfortable, as though something had been pushing against the inside of her skull. Derek said very little. He said that in his experience, the most dangerous situations were the ones that did not look dangerous. He said coal mines did not collapse because the supports looked weak. They collapsed because the supports looked strong, right up until the moment they were not. He said he would go along with whatever the group decided, but that he wanted it noted that he had reservations. Norma cast the deciding vote. She said she had spent 30 years studying this creature from a library, and she was not turning back now. We stayed. We hiked deeper into the hills, descending into a narrow, heavily wooded hollow that Dean had identified as a secondary campsite. High walls of exposed sandstone on two sides, dense old-growth canopy overhead, a clear stream along the bottom. Under normal circumstances, it would have been peaceful, but the feeling of the forest had changed. Fewer birds, muted insect noise. The air felt anticipatory, the way the atmosphere feels before a severe thunderstorm. We searched all day for physical evidence, tracks, droppings, feathers, anything. We found nothing. Whatever the Mothman was, it did not leave footprints. That evening, Dean and I hiked to the ridgetop for a clear view of the terrain. The Ohio River was a silver ribbon to the west. Point Pleasant was a scatter of lights in the distance. Dean said that in 20 years in these woods he had developed an instinct for when something was wrong, and that instinct was screaming at him. The woods felt wrong in a way he could not name, like a musical note played slightly flat, close enough to correct that you could not identify the error but wrong enough that it made your teeth ache. I asked why he had not voted to leave. He said, "Because I do not think it matters. I do not think leaving would help. Whatever this is, I think it is already too late." We returned to camp. Norma had been cross-referencing her records with a topographic map, marking historical sighting locations. She said she had found something. If you plotted all 112 sightings on a map and drew a line connecting them chronologically, the line formed a slowly tightening spiral centered on the TNT area. The same location where the first sighting occurred in 1966. The same area where Dean had seen the creature 2 nights before. She said the spiral suggested the Mothman was not moving randomly. It was circling something, or circling toward something. If you have been listening and have not yet subscribed to the channel, now would be a good time, because what happened next changed everything. The second night began around 2 in the morning during my watch shift. I was sitting by the fire with Derek, who was sharpening a hatchet, the rhythmic scraping providing a strange comfort. The forest was quiet, but not silent. I could hear the stream, small animals in the underbrush, a barred owl in the distance. Then those sounds stopped, not all at once. A slow recession, like the tide going out. First the owl, then the stream noise diminished. Then the insects, one species at a time, each falling silent until the only sounds were the fire and Derek's whetstone against steel. Derek noticed it too. He stopped sharpening and looked at me. He set the hatchet down carefully and reached for his headlamp. I shook my head. Something told me that turning on additional light would be a mistake. We sat in the firelight and waited. The silence deepened until it had a texture, a weight, a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums like water pressure at depth. And then we heard it, the hum, the same low, resonant hum Dean had described. It started below the threshold of conscious hearing, a vibration in my inner ear that gradually intensified until it became an audible tone, deep and steady, as though someone had struck a tuning fork the size of a building and held it against the bedrock. Derek stood up slowly. He whispered that he had felt that vibration before, in the mines, in the deepest tunnels. Sometimes the rock itself would vibrate before a collapse. Not a rumble, not a grinding, a hum. A single sustained tone that traveled through miles of stone and emerged in the tunnel as a sound that was more sensation than noise. The old miners called it the mountain singing. He said that when the mountain sang, you ran. We did not run. We should have. But when I turned around, the Mothman was standing at the edge of the hollow, not 40 yards away, but perhaps 15. Close enough to see details. The gray of its body was not uniform, but mottled and textured, like weathered stone. The surface did not look like skin, scales, feathers, or fur. It was something for which I had no category, something that seemed to shift and ripple even though the creature stood perfectly still. And the eyes were worse up close. They contained depth, layers, movement. Looking into them was like looking into a well with no bottom, a shaft descending not into the earth but into something else entirely, some other space where the rules were different and the things that lived there did not obey the laws of the world I knew. I do not know how long we stood there. Time lost its meaning during those encounters. Seconds felt like hours. The normal flow of time simply ceased to function in the presence of the Mothman, as though the creature existed in a different temporal framework and its proximity warped ours. At some point, the others woke up. I did not hear them emerge from their tents. I simply became aware that all 6 of us were standing in a line at the edge of the fire, facing the creature, and that the hum had intensified to where I could feel my teeth vibrating. Warren was weeping, not sobbing, just standing there with tears running silently down the deep creases of his face, his eyes fixed on the creature with an expression I could not read. Was it grief, awe, the recognition of a man who had spent his entire life hearing stories about something and was now, at 78, seeing it for himself and understanding that the stories had been inadequate? Norma was holding her notebook against her chest like a shield. Her lips were moving, and when I leaned closer, I heard what she was saying. She was reciting dates. December 15th, 1967. January 9th, 1978. March 3rd, 1986. The dates of every major disaster that had occurred in or near Point Pleasant since the Silver Bridge collapse. With each date, she spoke a number: 46, 11, 3, the death tolls. She was counting the dead. The creature tilted its head, a slight rotation that conveyed attention, interest. It was listening, as though it understood what Norma was saying, as though the numbers meant something to it. Then it did something that none of the historical accounts had described, something that I have never heard any other witness report, and something that I have struggled to convey in every telling of this story because the words available to me are insufficient to capture what I experienced. It spoke, not with a voice, not with sound in the conventional sense. The words appeared in my head fully formed, as clearly as if someone had whispered them directly into my ear canal, bypassing the air and depositing meaning straight into my auditory cortex. 3 words. The bridge, again. I looked at the others. April had her hands over her ears, even though there was nothing to block. Erica had dropped the satellite phone and was staring with glazed eyes. Derek had gone completely pale. Dean had his knife out, his hand shaking so badly the blade caught the light in rapid, stuttering flashes. They had all heard it, the same 3 words delivered directly into their minds, and they all knew what it meant. Point Pleasant had a new bridge. The Silver Memorial Bridge, built in 1969 to replace the one that collapsed, spanning the same stretch of the Ohio River, carrying the same highway. Thousands of vehicles crossed it every day. The creature held our gaze for another long moment, then opened its wings and launched itself into the air, rising above the hollow with that chest-vibrating thrum, climbing until the red glow of its eyes was just 2 points of light among millions. And then nothing. The hum faded. The forest sounds returned. We stood in the ruins of our camp because the wind from those wings had scattered everything. Tents, gear, food, strewn across the hollow like debris from an explosion. Dean picked up the satellite phone, checked that it was functioning, and said he was calling the authorities. He did not care how it sounded. He was going to report a potential structural threat to the Silver Memorial Bridge. He made the call. The dispatcher listened. When Dean finished, there was a long pause, and the dispatcher asked him to repeat what he had said. Dean repeated it. Then the dispatcher said she would forward the report to the county engineer. Her voice was professional, but there was something in her tone, a faint tremor, that made me think Dean was not the first person to call about the bridge that night. We broke camp in the pre-dawn gloom, packing what we could find in the scattered wreckage and leaving the rest. The hike back to the trailhead took 3 hours, and during those 3 hours nobody spoke more than a handful of words. We moved through the forest in single file, headlamps cutting the murk, each of us locked inside our own thoughts. We drove back to Point Pleasant, and Dean called the county engineer directly. He identified himself, gave his credentials, and reported what he had experienced. He did not mention the Mothman. He said that while camping in the hills above the river, he had observed unusual vibrations in the bedrock consistent with subsurface instability. He recommended an emergency bridge inspection. The engineer said the bridge was inspected regularly, and the most recent inspection had found no deficiencies. Derek took the phone. In his calm, deliberate voice, he described the vibrations, the deep, resonant hum he recognized from decades underground. He said the hum was consistent with stress patterns in large load-bearing structures, indicating microscopic fracturing in a structural element under sustained tension. He said in his professional opinion, the bridge should be closed immediately. The engineer asked several technical questions. Then he said he would make some calls. 2 days later, the Silver Memorial Bridge was closed for emergency inspection. The inspection found a fatigue crack in one of the primary eye-bar chains, a crack that had not been present 6 months earlier, a crack that had grown to 60% of the eye-bar's cross-section and that would have resulted in catastrophic failure within 4 to 6 weeks under normal traffic loads. 4 to 6 weeks, if the Mothman had not appeared, if Dean had not called, if Derek had not spoken the language engineers understand, if Warren had not provided the framework to interpret what we were seeing, if Norma had not spent 30 years cataloging the pattern, if April had not grabbed my arm and made me turn around, if Erica had not brought the satellite phone, if any single link in that chain had been broken, the bridge would have collapsed during a busy weekday. The engineers estimated that based on traffic patterns at the time of the projected failure, the death toll could have been between 70 and 120 people, men, women, children, families on their way to work, to school, to the grocery store, lives that would have ended in a plunge into the Ohio River because a piece of metal that was supposed to hold had decided, in the way that metal does, that it could not hold any longer. The bridge was repaired, reinforced, reopened 3 months later with new eye-bars and an upgraded monitoring system. The engineering team published a paper about the failure mode, and the crack was attributed to hydrogen embrittlement, a well-documented phenomenon in high-strength steel. The paper made no mention of vibrations in the bedrock, no mention of a creature with red eyes, no mention of 6 people who went camping and came back with a story nobody would believe. We never spoke about it publicly. Not as a group, not individually, not to reporters or researchers or enthusiasts who came looking for Mothman stories. Warren died the following spring, peacefully, in his sleep, at the farm where he had been born 79 years earlier. Norma added our sighting to her records, number 113, and continued her research until her eyesight failed. Erica went back to teaching. Derek went back to his quiet life in the hills above Charleston. April sold her photography equipment and took a job that did not require her to spend time in the woods after sundown. Dean kept working, kept patrolling, kept doing the job that had defined him for 20 years. But he told me once, over the phone, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, that he had not slept through the night since August of that year, and that he did not expect he ever would again. I still live within an hour of Point Pleasant. I still hear the hum sometimes late at night when the house is quiet. I do not know if it is real or if my brain is replaying a recording from the worst night of my life. What I know is this: the Mothman is real. I have seen it. I have stood in its presence and felt the weight of its attention and heard the words it placed inside my mind. I have watched it open those impossible wings and rise into a sky that seemed too small to contain it. It was warning us. It was giving us a chance to do what the people of 1967 could not. And we listened. And 120 people who will never hear this story went to work and came home that evening and kissed their families and went to bed, alive, because a thing with red eyes stood in the forest and told us what was coming. I do not know what the Mothman is. I do not know where it comes from, or where it goes, or why it chooses to appear in this particular stretch of the Ohio River Valley. I do not know if it is an animal, an entity, a manifestation of some force that we do not yet have the vocabulary to describe. I have made peace with not knowing, because some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be lived with, carried, turned over in the quiet hours before sleep like smooth stones in the palm of your hand, their weight and texture becoming familiar even as their origin remains a mystery. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. If you ever find yourself in the hills of West Virginia, in those ancient folded whispering hills that rise above the Ohio River, and if you see 2 points of red light watching you from the tree line, do not run, do not hide, stop, stand still, and listen, because it is trying to tell you something, and what it has to say might save your life. If this story resonated with you, and you have made it to the end without subscribing to this channel, I would truly appreciate it if you took a moment to do that now, and leave a comment below telling me whether you believe the Mothman is real, because I read every single one, and your voice matters more than you know. It was late June when the group arrived at Blackstone Ridge in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the valleys breathe mist and the ridgelines disappear into fog thick enough to swallow sound itself. I was not part of their expedition initially, but I knew what they sought. I worked as a ranger for the National Park Service, stationed in those mountains for nearly 30 years, and I had heard the stories. Everyone who came to Blackstone spoke of the legends, whispered them around campfires as if the words themselves might draw attention from something better left undisturbed. The six of them arrived in two vehicles on a Saturday morning when the sky hung gray and heavy above the valleys. Lewis Perry was the expedition leader, a man of 69 with the kind of beard that suggested he had been outdoors for most of his adult life. His shoulders remained broad despite his age, though his movement suggested the weight of years spent in difficult terrain. Beside him came Tina Alexander, a woman of 44 who introduced herself as a journalist interested in Appalachian folklore. She carried expensive camera equipment and notebooks filled with research about the old tales. Jerome Russell, 56 years old, presented himself as a biologist and documentary filmmaker, though what exactly he intended to film remained unclear. Valerie Griffin, 60 years old, seemed the most skeptical of the group, her gray eyes scanning the mountains with something close to suspicion. Cody Hayes, the youngest at 35, served as their guide and logistics coordinator, and he brought with him the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing terrain intimately. Mildred Butler, 75 years old, was perhaps the most unexpected member of the expedition. She had lived in these mountains her entire life, born and raised in a small community nestled between ridges, and she had agreed to join them as a cultural consultant, though her real purpose became clear only after we began hiking. I watched them check their equipment at the ranger station, where I reviewed safety protocols and trail conditions. Most expeditions in the Appalachian Mountains present only the ordinary dangers of wilderness travel, steep slopes and cold water, and the disorientation that comes when fog settles unexpectedly across forested terrain. But I studied their faces as I warned them about the old trails, the ones that most modern hikers avoided, and I recognized the hunger in their eyes. Lewis Perry asked me directly whether the stories about the Wampus Cat held any truth. I told him what I always tell visitors who ask about local legends. I said they were stories, nothing more, entertainment for people sitting around fires at night, a way to explain the sounds that animals make when humans encroach on their territory. He smiled at this, but his smile suggested he did not believe me. Perhaps that should have been my first warning to stop them from going. The first evening, they established their base camp in a clearing approximately 7 miles from the ranger station, a site I had specifically recommended as being among the safest in the region. The clearing offered excellent drainage and a reliable water source and an open view of the surrounding forest that prevented anything from approaching undetected. At least, that is what the geography suggested. Cody Hayes called me on the radio that first night, a standard check-in that rangers required of all extended expeditions. He reported that camp was secure and that the group had settled for the evening. His voice sounded normal, unconcerned, the voice of a man accustomed to wilderness travel and comfortable in the presence of darkness. I should have pressed him for more information about their actual intentions, but I was occupied with other duties and the regulatory check-in seemed routine. It was Jerome Russell who initiated the discussion about hiking the old trails that evening, according to what I later learned from Mildred Butler. He had studied the history of the region and mentioned that certain paths, abandoned for decades or perhaps generations, still appeared on 19th century maps. One particular trail, marked on maps from 1887, appeared to run from the northwest ridge down through a valley known locally as Grief Hollow, then up the opposite ridge toward a summit called Watcher's Peak. The official description of the trail had been removed from newer maps, and when Jerome asked Mildred about it, she became very quiet. Lewis Perry and Jerome Russell, according to Mildred's later account, pressed her for information. They wanted to know why the trail had been abandoned, whether it was merely a matter of poor maintenance, or whether there was some other reason the path had been deliberately erased from modern cartography. Mildred refused at first to discuss it, but eventually she told them what she knew. She explained that the old trail had been closed not by the government, but by the community itself, generations ago, when people who hiked it began to return changed. Some returned with unexplainable injuries, torn clothing and missing sections of flesh, as though something with claws had attempted to remove them piece by piece. Others returned with psychological damage so severe that they required institutionalization. A few did not return at all. The disappearances occurred sporadically across more than a century, the last confirmed case occurring in the 1950s, when a pair of brothers ventured onto the trail and only one emerged, mad and speaking only in fragments, unable to explain what had happened to his sibling. After that disappearance, the local community had essentially declared the trail forbidden territory, not through any official designation but through cultural consensus and collective fear. Hikers avoided it because their parents and grandparents avoided it, because the stories had been passed down as cautionary tales, because the mountains themselves seemed to resent the intrusion. Lewis Perry listened to this entire account without interrupting. When Mildred finished, he asked her a single question. Had she actually hiked the trail herself? She had not. Then, he suggested, perhaps the stories had accumulated and distorted over time, exaggerated through repetition, until they bore little resemblance to whatever actual phenomenon had originally prompted them. This is a common pattern in folklore, he noted, and he proposed that the group hike the old trail precisely to gather empirical data that might disprove the legends rather than reinforce them. Tina Alexander supported this proposal enthusiastically, seeing an opportunity for her journalism to expose the dangers of misinformation. Valerie Griffin expressed skepticism about the entire enterprise, though she did not explicitly oppose it. Jerome Russell seemed genuinely curious about whether wildlife patterns or geological features might have given rise to the stories. Only Cody Hayes and Mildred Butler offered resistance. Cody's opposition was professional, the voice of someone hired to keep a group safe, and he argued that hiking an unmaintained trail with no reliable maps created unnecessary liability and danger. But he could be overruled by the expedition leader, and Lewis Perry made it clear that was his intention. Mildred's opposition carried more weight and more sorrow. She told them that she had heard those stories her entire life, that she had known people who had experienced the terror of that trail, and that no good could come from deliberately awakening old terrors. She begged them to choose a different route, a different objective. But she was 75 years old and dependent on the group for her transportation home, and ultimately she could not prevent them from proceeding. The radio call I received that evening was concerning, though not in any way that would have justified intervention by park authorities. Cody Hayes reported that the group had decided to undertake a full-day hike on the following morning, departing early and returning before nightfall. I asked for their intended destination, and he was oddly reluctant to specify it at first, before finally admitting they planned to explore the old trail through Grief Hollow. I knew the place he meant. I had studied its history myself, had read the old accounts and spoken with elderly people in the surrounding communities who still carried the cultural memory of that place. I should have been more forceful in my response. I should have stated unequivocally that they would not be permitted to hike that trail under my responsibility as the ranking ranger in the area. Instead, I told Cody that I would meet them at the trailhead early the following morning to review the route and ensure they had proper equipment. This compromise satisfied no one, not truly, though it gave the appearance of authority and oversight. The night passed without further incident, though I did not sleep well. I lay in my ranger station bed listening to the sounds that the mountains make when they are truly dark, and I found myself thinking about Mildred Butler's words, about the way oral traditions carry information across generations, about whether 100 years of stories should be dismissed as mere folklore, or whether it represented genuine accumulated warning from people who knew the mountains intimately. By the time dawn broke over Blackstone Ridge, I had resolved to accompany them as far as the trailhead and to assess personally whether the conditions made hiking the old route genuinely dangerous or merely uncomfortable. I never imagined that this decision would mean I would witness what happened next. The morning arrived with unusual clarity, the kind of bright sunshine that makes the Appalachian Mountains seem almost domestic, almost safe. The group assembled at the trailhead where the old path had once been clearly marked, though decades of neglect had left only faint traces of blazing on the trees and a footpath that disappeared and reappeared unpredictably through dense undergrowth. Lewis Perry wore hiking boots and carried a substantial pack with provisions for the day. Tina Alexander had brought her camera equipment despite warnings about the difficulty of the terrain and the weight of camera gear in mountainous country. Jerome Russell moved with careful deliberation, studying the forest around him as if reading a language written in leaves and bark and stone. Valerie Griffin remained visibly unhappy about the entire enterprise, her expression suggesting resignation to decisions made by others rather than genuine enthusiasm. Cody Hayes displayed the focused attention of someone managing multiple safety concerns simultaneously, checking everyone's equipment and ensuring that communication devices were functional and that the group understood basic protocols for staying together and responding to emergency situations. Mildred Butler looked diminished in the morning light, aged by something beyond mere years, though she carried her pack with the confidence of someone who had walked these mountains in her youth. I accompanied them for approximately 1 mile along the trail, observing how the path gradually deteriorated as we moved deeper into the forest. The forest itself changed character as we descended into the valley. The trees grew older and taller, and the undergrowth became increasingly dense, creating a kind of twilight even in the middle of the morning as the canopy above blocked direct sunlight. The air grew colder and damper as we descended, and the sounds of the forest diminished until even our own footsteps seemed muted by the heavy atmosphere. When we reached approximately the 1 mile marker, I examined their preparedness one final time and determined that they possessed adequate supplies and equipment to complete a full-day hike, though conditions would be more challenging than standard maintained trails. I delivered my final warnings about staying together, maintaining communication, and immediately retreating if weather conditions deteriorated or if any member of the group became injured or exhausted. Lewis Perry assured me that he understood the protocols and that they would observe all necessary safety precautions. I watched them continue deeper into the valley, their figures gradually becoming smaller and less distinct as distance and fog combined to obscure them. I waited at that point for approximately 2 hours, as I had arranged to meet them at the opposite trailhead when they emerged from Grief Hollow. The hike through the valley required approximately 6 to 8 hours for fit hikers moving at a reasonable pace, which meant they should emerge around mid-afternoon if they maintained a steady schedule without extended rest breaks. The afternoon passed with increasing unease on my part, though I could identify no specific source for this anxiety. The weather remained clear, and there were no signs of approaching storms. The radio remained silent except for standard check-ins with the Central Ranger Station. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, approximately an hour before I expected them to emerge from the southern trailhead, I received a radio transmission from Cody Hayes. His voice was different than it had been that morning, tighter and higher in pitch, carrying a tension that suggested something had disrupted the expedition's planned progression. He did not provide specific information, only requesting that I maintain my position at the southern trailhead and that I have emergency medical supplies ready for immediate use. I asked whether someone in the group had been injured, but he responded only that something had happened on the trail and that they were proceeding as quickly as possible toward the exit point. The minutes that followed seemed to extend unnaturally, time behaving oddly as I waited for the group to emerge. When I later tried to account for the exact duration of this waiting period, I found that my sense of temporal sequence had become confused, as though the experience of anticipation had fundamentally distorted my perception of how long the actual wait had lasted. Eventually, I heard movement on the trail, the sound of people moving through undergrowth at an accelerated pace, not quite running but moving with the kind of urgency that suggests flight rather than normal hiking progression. Cody Hayes emerged first, his face pale and streaked with sweat, and behind him came the others in a loose cluster, their formations and composures considerably deteriorated from the orderly group I had observed that morning. Lewis Perry moved with a pronounced limp, his left leg appearing to function poorly, and Jerome Russell supported his right arm, both men showing signs of exertion far beyond what the hike should have demanded. Tina Alexander looked as though she had been crying, her camera equipment still clutched to her chest despite obvious disarray in her clothing and multiple tears in the fabric of her jacket. Valerie Griffin emerged with a cut on her forehead that had bled considerably, though the bleeding appeared to have slowed, leaving dried blood on the right side of her face. Mildred Butler was the last to emerge from the tree line, moving slowly and deliberately, and I immediately recognized in her expression the look of someone who had confronted something that confirmed every fear she had carried through 75 years of life in these mountains. I rushed to meet them and immediately attempted to assess injuries and determine what had occurred. Lewis Perry's limp proved to result from a deep laceration on his thigh, the cut long enough to require immediate professional medical attention and showing signs of contamination with debris from the forest. Jerome Russell reported that Lewis had stumbled on the trail and had caught his leg on a jagged rock, and while I had no reason to disbelieve this explanation, something about the way the wound presented suggested the possibility of a different cause. The cut was too clean in some places and too ragged in others, as though multiple implements of varying sharpness had created it. I cleaned and wrapped the wound as best I could using field medical supplies while simultaneously radioing for emergency evacuation. An ambulance was dispatched from the nearest town, approximately 45 minutes away, and Lewis was advised that he would likely require stitches and possibly screening for infection depending on the depth of the wound and the nature of the object that had caused it. Tina Alexander's injuries proved more psychological than physical, though she had torn her jacket in what appeared to be a struggle with brush, or possibly with something more resistant than simple vegetation. She was extremely reluctant to discuss what had occurred on the trail, and when pressed for information, she became emotional and uncommunicative. Valerie Griffin's head wound was more serious than it initially appeared, though it was not life-threatening, and I suspected she might require stitches, though the cut proved less deep than expected once I cleaned away the blood. Jerome Russell, despite his role in assisting Lewis, appeared physically unharmed, though he was trembling and his eyes carried an expression of shock that suggested something beyond simple physical exertion had affected him. Cody Hayes remained in a state of operational focus, assisting me with first aid and ensuring that everyone had water and opportunity to sit or lie down as needed. Mildred Butler simply stood silent, watching the forest from which they had emerged, her face carrying an expression of vindication mixed with something close to despair. It was only when we were waiting for the ambulance that I made my first direct inquiry about what had happened on the trail. I asked whether anyone had been attacked by an animal, and this question created immediate and visible distress in multiple members of the group. Lewis Perry, despite considerable pain from his wound, became agitated and insisted that no animal had caused his injury, that he had fallen on the trail exactly as the initial explanation had stated. Jerome Russell's hands began to shake more noticeably, and he looked away from me, directing his gaze toward the forest in a way that suggested he was watching for something. Tina Alexander began crying again without speaking, and Valerie Griffin put a hand on her shoulder, which seemed to offer some comfort, though the gesture also suggested shared experience of trauma. Cody Hayes exchanged a glance with Mildred Butler, and in that exchange I recognized the acknowledgement of a shared understanding that something significant had been deliberately withheld from my initial inquiries. I pressed harder for information, using my authority as a ranger to explain that full disclosure was necessary for my ability to determine whether the area required evacuation for public safety. My words prompted Lewis Perry to provide a more detailed account of the afternoon's events, though his narrative was careful and measured, with noticeable gaps and omissions where details seemed absent or deliberately excluded. According to Lewis Perry's account, the group had maintained reasonable pace through the morning and early afternoon, making good progress along the old trail despite its deteriorated condition. The forest around them had become increasingly dense, and the light had diminished as they descended deeper into the valley, until the surrounding illumination was reduced to a kind of permanent dusk even at midday. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, according to his timeline, the group had paused for a rest and for brief meal consumption at a location that Mildred had identified as significant, a kind of natural clearing where a large rock formation provided shelter and where the old trail crossed a small stream. It was during this rest period that Jerome Russell had observed something unusual in the forest approximately 30 feet from the group's position. He described seeing movement in the undergrowth and hearing a sound that he characterized as a vocalization of some kind, though he was unable to specify what animal might produce such a sound. The vocalization had seemed to come from a point above the ground, suggesting an animal of substantial size moving through the forest canopy, rather than along the ground level. Lewis Perry dismissed the observation at first, suggesting it was likely a deer or possibly a black bear responding to the presence of humans in the forest. But Mildred Butler had immediately suggested that the group gather their equipment and move rapidly toward the southern trailhead, abandoning the planned rest period and accelerating their pace along the remaining route. Her urgency was sufficient to compel compliance even from those who questioned her judgment, and the group had resumed hiking at an increased pace without significant resistance. They had hiked for approximately another hour at this accelerated pace when the incident had occurred that resulted in Lewis Perry's injury. Lewis's account of this incident became vague and contradictory at this point, suggesting either genuine confusion about what had happened or deliberate obfuscation of details. He stated that he had stumbled on a section of trail and had fallen, catching his leg on something sharp as he went down. When I asked what exactly he had caught his leg on, he was unable to provide specifics. When I asked why the injury had produced multiple distinct cuts of varying shapes if it had resulted from a single fall on a single object, he became defensive and insisted that he did not actually know exactly what had occurred, that it had all happened very quickly, and he had been focused on the pain rather than on systematic observation of the injury's cause. Jerome Russell and Valerie Griffin offered no additional details to illuminate what had occurred at the moment of Lewis's fall. Tina Alexander, when I asked her directly, refused to provide any statement at all, shaking her head repeatedly and asking whether we could simply leave the trail and return to civilization. Cody Hayes provided the only additional detail of substance, mentioning that the group had heard the vocalization again approximately 15 seconds after Lewis had fallen, and that this time the sound had come from directly behind them on the trail, rather than from a distance. The sound had prompted the group to assist Lewis immediately, and to resume hiking at the fastest pace that his injury would permit, abandoning the notion of reaching the northern trailhead and instead turning directly toward the southern exit. All of this should have been sufficient cause for me to close the trail officially and to launch a comprehensive investigation into whether the area posed genuine risk to public safety. Instead, I made a decision born of uncertainty and a lingering doubt about whether I was genuinely failing to recognize what had occurred, or whether I was accepting deliberately false accounts of natural but explainable incidents. The ambulance arrived approximately 45 minutes after Lewis's evacuation had been called, and he was transported to the nearest hospital with instructions for wound monitoring and infection screening. The rest of the group was transported back to their lodging at the base of Blackstone Ridge, where they had rented cabins for their expedition's duration. I did not see them again until the following morning, when I received a radio call requesting that I meet Lewis Perry at the hospital. He had been released after 12 stitches, and after medical examination had determined that the wound, while serious, posed no ongoing medical risk and did not suggest the involvement of any specific animal species based on the wounding pattern. The hospital physician had noted that the injury was unusual, but had attributed this to the irregular nature of whatever object had caused the wound, possibly jagged rock, or possibly wood, with sharp projections. Lewis Perry, when I met with him at the hospital, was more forthcoming than he had been at the trailhead. He explained that Mildred Butler had told the group, during the previous evening and after I had departed, about something she had encountered in her youth. She had hiked a portion of the old trail when she was 17 years old, approximately 58 years before our conversation, and she had encountered something that had fundamentally altered her understanding of what inhabited the mountains she called home. She had not provided complete details of what had occurred that day, but she had made it clear that what she had encountered was not a conventional animal. The group, according to Lewis Perry, had been motivated by Mildred's partial disclosure to hike the old trail precisely in hopes of encountering what she had described. They had believed that documentation of whatever phenomenon existed might shed light on Appalachian folklore and might provide empirical evidence for things that people in mountain communities had whispered about for generations. Lewis Perry had been aware of the risks and had accepted them as part of the expedition's objective. When I asked him directly what he believed had caused his injury, he looked toward the hospital window and refused to answer. When I pressed him further, he said only that he did not believe we should discuss this matter any further, that the group had agreed not to provide additional details, and that attempting to compel disclosure would be both futile and potentially dangerous. He explained that there were reasons the trail had been abandoned, reasons that had nothing to do with superstition or collective hysteria, and everything to do with the deliberate survival of people who inhabited these mountains, and the conscious decision not to trespass on territories that were not human territory. He suggested that I consider my role as ranger to involve protection of both human visitors and the non-human inhabitants of the wilderness in my care, and that some boundaries should be respected precisely because they existed for important reasons. I did not sleep well in the weeks that followed the group's evacuation from the old trail. I found myself researching the history of Grief Hollow and Watcher's Peak with an intensity that began to occupy all of my off-duty time. I traveled to libraries and university archives and spoke with anthropologists and folklorists and with elderly residents of the surrounding communities who had grown up hearing stories about the mountains. What emerged from these investigations was a consistent pattern of accounts separated by decades and even by centuries, but carrying remarkable similarity in the essential details. The accounts spoke of something large enough to move with terrifying speed through forest terrain, something with physical capacity to inflict serious injury, something that seemed to interact deliberately with humans who ventured into certain areas but that did not hunt humans as prey. The earliest accounts I could locate dated back to the 1780s, shortly after European settlement of the region began to extend into the more remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains. These early accounts existed primarily in the form of oral histories recorded in the journals of surveyors and in letters written by settlers. though many of the documents had been deliberately destroyed or hidden, suggesting that people in the 19th century had actively worked to conceal information about what inhabited these mountains. The accounts used various names across generations and regions. The Wampus Cat was the most common designation in the immediate area around Blackstone Ridge, but other names appeared in different localities. In some accounts it was described as resembling a mountain lion or cougar, animals that should not exist in the eastern mountains, but that appear with remarkable consistency in the folklore across centuries. Other accounts suggested something larger than a cougar, something almost impossible to kill, something that seemed to possess an awareness and intelligence beyond animal instinct. One particularly detailed account from 1897 described an encounter between three hunters and what the narrator called the Wampus Beast in a location approximately 3 miles from where Lewis Perry had been injured. According to this account, the hunters had heard a sound that they interpreted as a wounded animal and had attempted to track it. The hunt had ended when the creature had essentially herded them toward a cliff face and when it had become clear that the hunters had become prey rather than pursuers. Only one of the 3 hunters had survived, and his account reported that the creature had not attacked the group directly, but had rather cut off their retreat and had pushed them progressively toward increasingly untenable terrain. When one hunter had fallen, the creature had ignored him, and his survival had depended on lying absolutely still while the thing passed over and around him in the darkness. The implication seemed to be that the creature was selective about whom it attacked or pursued, and that survival depended not on physical resistance, but on understanding the thing's apparent parameters and communicating non-threat through specific behaviors. I shared these research findings with Cody Hayes when he contacted me by phone approximately 3 weeks after the group's departure from Blackstone Ridge. He had remained in the area after the others had returned to their ordinary lives, claiming to have additional research objectives, but actually spending his time in conversations with local residents and in visits to community archives. He told me that he had decided not to return to his normal work as an expedition guide, and that he was considering relocating to the Appalachian region permanently. He had become convinced, based on the accounts he had reviewed and the conversations he had conducted, that the folklore represented genuine phenomena rather than mere superstition. He had asked Mildred Butler for permission to visit her at her home, and she had agreed to speak with him in depth about the incident she had experienced in her youth and about what she believed inhabited the mountains. According to Cody Hayes' account of his conversation with Mildred Butler, she had encountered the creature when she was 17 years old while hiking the old trail with a group of older teenagers from her community. One member of their group had deliberately ventured into a restricted area, an area that local tradition held to be the creature's primary territory. The group had realized quickly that they had triggered something when they heard the sound that Jerome Russell would later describe, a vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, even when it originated from a single source. Mildred's group had attempted to flee, but they had been unable to move faster than the creature could pursue. One member of their group, a young man named Thomas Caldwell, had been struck by the creature and had been gravely injured, though he had survived. He had spent the remainder of his life in various institutions for the care of people with severe psychological trauma, and he had never spoken coherently about what he had experienced. Mildred had survived by understanding something that the creature seemed to recognize and respect. When the creature had focused its attention on her, she had not attempted to run and had not attempted to hide, but had instead stood still and had made clear through her body language that she was not a threat and that she did not intend aggression. The creature had circled her slowly, and she had been aware with absolute certainty during those moments that she was being assessed and that her survival depended on appearing neither predatory nor prey. When the creature had apparently concluded that she was not a threat and was not worth pursuing, it had simply moved away, and the group's surviving members had been able to escape. Mildred had carried the memory of that encounter for more than 5 decades, and she had deliberately avoided any further contact with that territory. When the expedition had approached her about joining their effort to hike the old trail, she had not explicitly refused but had shared enough details of the danger that she had hoped to discourage them. When they had proceeded anyway, she had accompanied them partially out of a sense of obligation and partially out of a belief that perhaps the time had come to understand more clearly what inhabited the mountains. The injury that Lewis Perry had suffered had seemed to confirm, at least in Mildred's judgment, that the creature still inhabited the territory and still responded to human incursion with defensive violence, though the creature had apparently chosen not to inflict lethal injury, despite having the capacity to do so. Cody Hayes' own assessment, after reviewing the evidence and speaking with Mildred Butler, was that Lewis Perry's group had been fortunate. They had stumbled upon something genuinely dangerous, something that killed and fed and maintained territory in ways that resembled predatory animals, but that possessed an intelligence and intentionality that transcended mere animal behavior. The creature had apparently decided that the humans who had invaded its territory could be driven away without the necessity of lethal force, and this decision had resulted in an injury severe enough to compel evacuation, but not severe enough to prove fatal or permanently disabling. If the creature had chosen differently, if it had chosen to execute the kind of attack that it had been apparently capable of executing, the outcome would have been substantially different. I asked Cody Hayes directly whether he believed the creature to be a documented animal species that had somehow escaped scientific classification, or whether he believed it to be something more anomalous, something that transcended conventional zoological categories. He answered only that he believed the creature to be real in the sense that it occupied physical space and manifested physical effects, and that beyond this basic observation, attempting to categorize it seemed counterproductive. He suggested that the people who lived in the Appalachian Mountains had developed a kind of pragmatic coexistence with the phenomenon, accepting its existence and establishing behavioral protocols that minimized dangerous encounters. He believed that the deliberate closure of the old trail and the cultural transmission of stories warning against that particular area represented a form of crowdsourced survival strategy rather than superstition or misinformation. He was researching whether similar patterns existed in other regions of the Appalachian Mountain Range, whether there were other territories that were deliberately avoided, and other stories that carried consistent details across generations and across communities that had no contact with each other. I have not returned to my formal duties as a ranger since that conversation. I took a leave of absence that was eventually converted into medical retirement, based on a kind of stress-related psychological reaction that the agency deemed sufficiently severe to warrant termination of employment. I remain in the Appalachian region, though not in the town where I previously worked. I have moved to a smaller community approximately 50 miles from Blackstone Ridge, a place where I can observe the mountains from a distance and can conduct research without the particular pressures and limitations that come with official capacity. I maintain contact with Cody Hayes, who is conducting systematic research into the folkloric and possibly historical phenomenon that he has come to call the Appalachian Guardian, by which he means the creature or creatures that inhabit these mountains and that maintain territories that are recognized and respected by people who live here. I have reviewed Jerome Russell's documentary, which was eventually completed, and which presented the creature as a cryptozoological phenomenon, worthy of serious scholarly attention rather than as a supernatural element or as mere folklore. The documentary was not broadcast on any major media outlet, but it circulates among communities of people interested in unexplained phenomena, and it has prompted other research expeditions and other investigations into the nature of the creature. I have spoken with Tina Alexander by email, as she refuses to discuss the expedition in person or by phone. She has indicated that she is working on a written account of her experience, though she has made clear that this account will not be available to the general public while people directly involved in the incident are still living. She has also hinted that she encountered evidence during the expedition that went beyond the explicit injury that Lewis Perry had suffered. Evidence that she believes might constitute proof of the creature's existence in a more tangible form than anecdotal report and folkloric account. Lewis Perry has returned to his ordinary life, and I understand that he lectures occasionally about cryptozoology and about the possibility that documented folklore contains references to genuine phenomena rather than to purely imaginative constructs. His injury has healed, though he walks with a slight limp that appears to be permanent, a physical reminder of what he encountered on the old trail. Valerie Griffin expressed in one communication that her experience on Grief Hollow had fundamentally altered her understanding of what was possible and had changed her perspective on Appalachian culture and history in ways that she was still processing years after the event. Mildred Butler died 2 years after the expedition, at the age of 77, and she requested in her will that specific documents and journals that she had maintained for decades be transferred to university archives where they might be studied by scholars interested in Appalachian folklore. Those documents contained detailed accounts of encounters with the creature, spanning decades of her own life and incorporating accounts from people she had known who had their own encounters. The documents suggest that the creature's behavior is not random, but follows patterns that indicate both intelligence and a form of territorial respect that allows for some level of coexistence. As I write this account, I am aware that it is likely to be dismissed by many readers as fiction, as a creative narrative rather than as a factual account of actual events. I have not provided names of actual institutions or specific dates that could be cross-referenced against public records, because I am aware of the privacy concerns of the people directly involved in the expedition. I am aware also that claiming to have knowledge of an undocumented animal species is likely to damage the credibility of anyone who makes such claims, and I am providing this account not in hopes of convincing skeptical audiences, but rather in the hope that people who live in or who visit the Appalachian Mountains might receive it as a warning or as guidance. If you find yourself in these mountains, respect the old stories and respect the boundaries that local communities have established. If you encounter evidence that something non-standard inhabits this territory, remember that the best strategy for survival is not resistance or flight, but rather communication that you are not a threat and do not intend to persist in areas that you do not belong. The mountains are not human territory exclusively, and the creatures that inhabit them have been doing so far longer than humans have. If you come to this place seeking adventure or seeking to prove that the stories are not true, you will find instead that the mountains guard their secrets carefully and that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The old trail through Grief Hollow remains officially closed, and it remains unofficially respected as a boundary between territories that should not be crossed. If you see warning signs or if you hear stories that suggest particular areas should be avoided, it might be wise to listen and to accept that the wisdom of generations might be based on understanding that transcends mere superstition or fear.